Hi, guys. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Cleared Sun podcast. This is Francois, and I'm here today with Rowell. Hey, Rowell, how are you?
Hello, good morning. Glad to be here.
So, today we wanted to do a little bit of a troubleshooting story episode, kind of share, some of the experience we have in the field with you guys, talk about, the problems, and maybe that will resonate with what you guys are seeing in the field. So we might have some of these short troubleshooting story episodes that you can listen to, and maybe you can also learn from that experience. So if you see the same problem in the field, that can help you to troubleshoot the issue. And today we have a problem that you encountered in the last week or two, and as you were trying to deploy Mist AP45 access points in a car manufacturing facility. So I'll let you take it away. Tell us what the problem was, what the context was, and I don't know. Do we know the root cause? Have we fixed the issue? I guess that's all the questions for you.
Yeah, this one was interesting because I had worked with this facility for over a year. I initially got engaged with troubleshooting some of their Wi Fi issues with their tools. Their tools are all on Wi Fi and they use that to build the cars. And so in the end, I actually told them they needed to move a lot of their access points and use antennas because it was omnidirectional in this facility, and they take the tools under the car, and so with all that metal there, the signal
Hmm.
is really being deflected. And so I created a new design, sold on missed access points, and so ended up delivering it one day. I think it was the Wednesday prior to the installation on Saturday. So I opened up the box, I gave them an AP, and I said, "Why don't we just test it out real quick? Make sure your stuff works on this network." And so on that test, there was just massive failures on their tests. And so I made a call and said, you know what, let's figure out what the issue is on your network and then reschedule the installation. And so a couple weeks pass, we get this installation scheduled on a weekend. And they were telling me like all the tests passed, so we're good to install. And so we started installing these access points. I had two installers with me. I think we replaced 70 some access points throughout the whole facility. And as we start replacing them, I start getting little comments like, hey, this thing is not working or this isn't working. And I'm like, okay, well, we're already doing the install. I'm trying to help my guys also swap out access points. So I would get uh, later down, like later in the afternoon, like near the end of the day, I would start getting the actual issue. So they were saying, laptops, they don't have, when they connect, they have no internet. Actually, they would describe it as there's no internet. Or, hey, if I go to another access point, the roaming is not very good. Um, or, yeah, those are the two most common ones. And so obviously I'm like, hey, why don't we just pull up Mist? Because Mist will, the dashboard, it'll just show you what those issues are. And the most common issue that I saw, sometimes over 30% of the issues, was DHCP. And so I would tell them, hey, why don't you check your DHCP server? The common things like make sure there's enough IP addresses in the pool. Can you get to the DHCP server? There was a firewall in place, so my scope was just the wireless portion. And so I kind of relied on their IT team to be like, hey, do you see those DHCP requests going through the firewall, sending it to the server? Do you have a relay? All that stuff. And they told me, yeah, everything was set up. But I was like, well, something's wrong, right? Because it says here there's DHCP issues. I think we should trust what this says and figure out what the DHCP issue is, even if you have to go, you know, do the packet capture over the air, do the packet capture at the AP port, do it at the switch port, all the way upstream to the DHCP server. Or I just said, hey, go straight to the DHCP server, do a packet capture. Do you see DHCP requests coming through? And so I just went back to finishing the install because we want to be out of there within the day or at least in the evening, and come back and they're like, yeah, there's still an issue. And so, okay, I'm like, at the end of the day, we got most of the APs done, and I'm like, there's still DHCP issues. It's like 8 o'clock at night. I'm like, why don't I just dive into this tomorrow? And so I go into it, still looking at DHCP issues, and what I did find were a lot more problems because I started really looking at um, the Mist dashboard. I saw things like missing VLANs. Like every once in a while, Marvis would show, "Hey, you have missing VLANs here on this switch," and they had Juniper switches, existing Juniper switches, but they weren't in the dashboard. But what's nice is that Mist kind of sees that and shows you all these switches. And so I'm like, all right, DHCP issues, missing VLANs. To me, that immediately I go, all right, we're just missing some VLANs on these switch ports. But I recall that I had spoken to their IT. I said, hey, like, how do you want to handle this when we replace your existing controller with Mist APs? Because we're not tunneling traffic back to a controller. We've got to put a trunk and the VLANs, and they told me like when you plug it in, it'll work. And I was like, okay, I'll just trust what they say. And so and now, but mind you, I'm doing all of this remote. I'm not even on site at this point. And I think I spent a whole week trying to figure out what their issues were remotely. And a lot of those ports were missing VLANs. They just didn't have they weren't set up as a trunk. It was just set up as an access port. The AP
Mhm.
got an IP address, but the clients, once they joined the AP, they weren't getting an IP address. And so that's what led to a
Because
lot of the DHCP issues.
you had configured the clients to get an IP in all the VLANs, right?
Right. Yeah. The
Okay.
WLANs were set up. There was a few WLANs and they were all tagged to a specific VLAN. And I would tell them like, hey, because they would say it's a Wi-Fi issue, and it's like I see clients connecting successfully to Wi-Fi,
Mhm.
they're just not getting DHCP. So that means I had to explain the whole DORA process, the
Mhm.
discover, offer, all that. And I was like, well, can you just check? I think what can you just check the AP switch port? And that's what I would say, right? But they didn't know which one to go to. Like out of 70s, like which one do we go to? What's nice in Marvis is you can actually do a query, ask a question. And so I would ask a question, rank all of the um, I don't know if it was access points or clients that were having a certain client event, like a DHCP timed
Mhm.
out issue, and rank them to where most of the incidents are or the issues are. And so it lists all the APs. I'm like, okay, let's look at this AP. This one has the most issues on it. And that's just where most of the devices connect. And so we looked at it and it's like, okay, access port, guys, that should be a trunk with all the VLANs that's on it. They fixed that issue. I'm like, why don't we just look at all those ports? It would just be
Mhm.
easier now to just verify that they are all configured because what we found is that there's a ton of them that weren't configured properly. Because that also manifested as like, hey, roaming doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Because you went on an AP that did have the trunks to an AP that no longer had the trunks. So roaming broke. So I would get issues like, hey, the laptops aren't working, my phone isn't working, the tools aren't working. And it's like, okay, let's focus on one issue rather than
Mhm.
freaking out about a widespread issue. Like it's a widespread issue. Therefore, we can look at the infrastructure. But I wanted to narrow it down. Like, let me look at one client. Give me a MAC address. And so that was the other problem is they would just say, we have problems. There's Wi-Fi issues. I don't know if these APs are working. And it's like, no, like it's telling us what the problem is. No one's
Mhm.
looking into it. And so I was like, give me a MAC address. Like these tools had the MAC address printed right on the on the device. I'm like, give me the MAC address of that exact tool that has the issue.
Mhm.
And so we would get it. And some of them would say DHCP, some of them wouldn't. It would give me some weird error, like a GAS something something couldn't connect. And so I started looking into that more too, because I'm like, that's not a DHCP issue. That's a separate issue.
Mhm.
And Mist is the dashboard's telling me like this is the problem. Like a GAS timeout for a query timeout. And I'm like, huh, I've never seen that one before. But being remote, I wasn't there. I couldn't do the packet capture. But what's nice is in that error, the Mist dashboard provided the packet capture. and I opened it and I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna find in here, right? And it shows me the association. It shows a probe request, the probe response, association, and so I'm looking at it, and I don't know how this happened because I think it did try to do the association after the probe request and
Hmm.
response, but in the probe response, the AP actually denied um, was basically telling the client you're incompatible with this Wi-Fi network. And it was in the probe
Hmm.
response. You had to expand it, and you see a whole sentence that said, um, the client something around the client wasn't compatible because you do not support short preamble. And I was like, oh, that's a good error message right there that miscaught as a packet capture because it just wasn't displayed. That message wasn't displayed in the Mist dashboard or in the client events. I think that's where I got kind of hung up on that is I'm relying on the logs, right? What it's showing me. And a lot of times I don't always go into the packet capture because I actually assumed that it
Hmm.
would just give whatever it showed in the packet capture would display in the right on the screen. But in this case, it
Yeah.
didn't for that reason. And so when I looked at those tools, I noticed that the ones that did work were actually connected to 5 gigahertz, but the ones that were failing were all trying to do 2.4, even though the
Hmm.
devices supported 5. And I was like, okay, well, I could either turn off 2.4 and force them to go to 5, but I didn't know whether or not they were hard coded to 2.4 because I know these devices, the manufacturer of the tools, they statically assigned IP addresses on these because the other issue that I saw was a DHCP inform timeout. And so that's a client informing the DHCP server, like, hey, I've got this IP address, but I need other information from you about the network. And those were timing out. And so I wasn't sure, like, okay, if I turn off 2.4, I don't know if they'll actually connect to 5. We could have tried it, but it was like during production, and I was telling them, well, they're already not working. So I don't know what the
Hmm.
difference would be if I made the change. But I ended up opening a ticket with Miss Support saying, hey, here's what I see. Is there a way to enable um, the long preamble? And they said there was like they could bring it up in the GUI. So they did that. And I think somebody told me in the CTS Slack, or maybe it was you, friends. I don't know. Someone in CTS Slack said you could actually enable it via the API. And I was like, oh, okay. But
Hmm.
I wanted something to show the IT team, like, hey, for your tools, you got to select this. And so once I enabled that, like all the devices started reconnecting to Wi-Fi, but we still had the DHCP issue, right? Um, so all of these kind of led to, hey, why don't we do a network audit? I actually proposed that to them, like, hey, let me be the third party that'll just audit your network and look at the config, kind of figure out what's going on because we resolve the trunk issue. The AP is not having the trunk because we still had DHCP issues after that, right? And I'm like,
Hmm.
well, that's kind of odd. If we saw what the problem was, the APs didn't have the trunk ports. Why do we still have issues? Like I thought we would have resolved it by now. But what happened is the DHCP issues went from being like 31% of all the issues to being now like a smaller number, like 15%, but still a problem. And so I spent like 3 hours. I'm like, this is not an AP issue. This is something on the network. I went straight to the firewall. But then I learned that the traffic didn't even go through the firewall for DHCP. And I was like, okay, where do these gateways live for this? So I needed a network diagram and um, basically worked backwards and trying to troubleshoot, right? So as a Wi-Fi person, I could have just easily said, hey, look, this is not a Wi-Fi issue. This is a network issue. You guys need to
Hmm.
resolve it. And I could have just like wiped my hands clean of that situation. But I didn't. I was like, well, I have networking background. Let me dig into it for you guys. And what I did find is, sometimes you just got to look at the logs, right? Even though these switches were not in the dashboard, I started just looking at logs. And Junos is really good, right? So I'm seeing a lot of the same kind of log, but I'm going to exclude that because it has nothing to do with what I'm dealing with. And so now it just narrows down. a few messages, and right away I saw um, an issue where it had to do with port security. It says something like reached MAC limit on a switch port.
Mm,
And I was like, okay, is
mm,
that a switch port for an AP? And so I looked at the config, and it says only limit this port. It was basically all the ports. Limit these ports to just 3 MAC addresses. And I was like, okay, so let me do a show Ethernet switching table on an AP port. Sure enough, like the first MAC address is an AP port, or the AP MAC address. The second one is the first client, and the third one is the second client. And then if you go to the AP, it's like, yeah, here's all the other clients, but they have no IP address. They're connected, but there's no
mhm,
IP.
mhm.
That leads to the symptom of a user saying, "I have no internet." And so I would ask them, like, "You have no internet, but are you joined to an SSID, and which one?" And prior to that, I was like using Marvis, like to rank all the clients with this client event of DHCP timeout over the course of the last 60 minutes. And I would see it, and I'm like, okay, there's got to be a correlation here. Where are all devices connecting? But they were everywhere. And so I went on every switch, and they had a lot because it's a big facility. And every single switch had port security. I'm like, okay, I need you guys to at least turn off port security for the ports with
The
the APs
APs.
on it. And so
Mhm.
that immediately got rid of every single issue on Wi-Fi. And I think I see a few here and there. Um, I saw like 4 DHCP servers listed. Basically, their gateways lived on their core switch, and I saw um, 4 DHCP servers listed, but only 2 were responding. Um, and so I
Mhm.
listed that. And then I saw, eventually, after all these messages went away, the only issue was their guest network. And, most people would say, like, okay, guest network, it's not that important. But in this facility, like every person who comes in, like their devices connect to the guest network, and there's no cell signal for most of these.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, they need to be on guest Wi-Fi. And they were still having DHCP issues, but this network specifically had its gateway on the firewall. So I was like, okay, let me check the firewall. It has the right DHCP relay. It's going to the right DHCP server. Um, it should be working, because I saw clients did have IP addresses, but then some clients didn't have IP addresses, or it just wasn't working. Um, I found out that their other controller was still on and connected to the
Mm,
network. And so I went to the network guy. I'm like, hey, can you go on your controller and tell me if you see clients, but they're not associated to an AP? And he's like, yeah, there's like 20 clients on there. I'm like, all right, can we shut off the interfaces for this on their switch? Shut them off. And then like those devices that had issues now work. And I'm like, okay. Um, we should have had that on the checklist to, once we replace all the
mhm.
APs, turn off the controller. But there were still like a handful that were having problems. And I'm like, man, I don't know. I'm running out of I'm running out of ideas with what this could be. I've done the AP trunk ports, tagged VLANs. I've done checking the DHCP servers, the removing the port security. And then I just happen to look at the dashboard, and I see these logs of gateway spoofing, because I had looked at
Mm,
their firewall, and I'm like, the DHCP scope includes the gateway. And I'm like, I can't find where they exclude certain IP addresses. And so I see gateway spoofing, and this one device had the gateway IP. And I'm like, can I ping this guy? And so I'm like trying to ping, and it's like hit or miss with the pings, because now there's two
mhm.
duplicate IP addresses. And I'm like, hey, can you exclude your gateway from your DHCP list, and I'll boot this device so it can regain an IP. And after that, like, all issues were gone. But I was like, after that, I'm like, dude, I'm tired. I don't know.
Yeah.
There was a lot of things to dig into, and it kind of shows to me. Even though I was engaged with just the Wi-Fi portion, I felt like I needed to be. I should have had a plan for the network side, even though they had a network team. And I think if I had a checklist of what to look for, um, and what we would do when we transition over, it probably would have been a lot smoother. But we went like a few days with some issues, but got some of the more immediate needs resolved pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think your story highlights a couple of things. I think the first one is that Wi-Fi. Yeah, even though we're like specialized in Wi-Fi, it still sits on top of the network. So if you have some networking problems, you'll see them on the Wi-Fi, and people will just tell you Wi-Fi sucks.
Yeah,
And I've seen that in the past too. So um, and it's, I mean, doing the network audit before the installation would have been the good thing to do,
yeah,
but then you also trust that the network is in good standing because their existing Wi-Fi is working. So it's a little challenging, but I guess we can, you can have like a different checklist for before the installation next time, where
yeah.
you can validate a couple of things. um yeah, and
I
then
just wasn't
sometimes
sure
when
how
you,
their test worked. How did the test
yeah.
pass if we had those issues?
Yeah, or you have, but even during the test, some of these issues they would not appear, like the MAC address security. If they just test one client, it's not going to show
Yeah,
up. The
exactly.
gateway spoofing is not going to show up. The roaming is not going to show up. So yeah, it's interesting. And also, like what I was going to say is sometimes people who are maintaining the network, they also have to maintain all the stuff. They're not like,
Yeah,
they have to look at the servers. They, for smaller companies, it's challenging for them to kind of be subject matter expert on all of the stuff they work on, right?
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so, so that's the first thing. Second thing is, I think as a Wi-Fi professional, it's important to understand networking, at least the basics, so you can understand, what the DHCP is, port security, the gateway spoofing, duplicate IPs, all of these stuff. If you understand them, you're not afraid to kind of dig deeper. So I think it's important to have that background when you do Wi-Fi. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, I always rely on the MAC address because it's the
Hmm.
unique identifier for a client. And when with them, they were just telling me Wi-Fi issues here, Wi-Fi issues there. I'm like, hey guys, like I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but I keep asking
Hmm.
for a MAC address. I can't help you. Like it's
Hmm.
a needle in the haystack when you just say there's issues. But if you give me a MAC address, I can probably pinpoint what the issue might
Hmm.
be. And that took time as well. And I think even before you do the rollout, it's like, hey, if we have an issues, here are the steps we should follow in order to gather
Hmm.
the right information so we can resolve it pretty quickly.
Hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that story, Rowell.
Yeah.
Keep on listening. We will be back with more troubleshooting stories. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Have a good
Thank
week.
you.